Hi everyone, I'm back again. I've done a couple of these videos in short succession, and so feels like I've just made one, which I did earlier on today, I think, or yesterday. Anyway, we've got, I think, 3 questions to look at here. The first one by Parker LeBaron. Hi Parker, 15 upvotes. So very popular question, excellent question as well, which we should talk about. I think it's a great way to discuss liberalism and a great way into that. So we'll start there. So Parker's question is, Robert Keohane claims that he is a liberal and believes in liberal institutionalism because he believes in checks and balances. How are the checks and balances of liberal institutionalism different from the checks and balances provided in America's constitutional republic? And so I think I said, I think I had a go at somebody in my comments on the research question last week when we were discussing liberalism about trying to disentangle a little bit liberalism that we hear about in the news, the Democratic Party, and liberalism in international relations theory. And when I said that, I said, let's try and keep them separate, but it's fair enough because they do share this common ancestor. And I think what Parker's getting at here is this common ancestor, right? That the origin of the ideas that led to the United States constitutional republic over here did also lead to this other sort of branch of liberalism, if you like, liberalism in international relations. And so we'll talk about it. We'll talk about some of the commonalities because Parker's asking what are the differences, but actually I think we should start with maybe what's the same, because I think we'll find a lot's the same and that there might not be, in my opinion, very much difference. But certainly as we do that, bear in mind that what we're talking about is Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, I was going to say Morgenthau, but I didn't mean Morgenthau. Montesquieu is who I meant, of course. Did I say Rousseau? Those guys. And then, of course, the Americans, right? Hamilton and Madison, especially, and Jefferson. So these folks at Kant, who we've already read in this class, Kant, especially for international relations, Kant. But those other people, the types of sort of principles that they held to, the types of arguments that they made that led to the founding of the United States, also the framing of the US Constitution, also leads to the basis of what becomes liberalism. I think with that aside now, I want to sort of talk a little bit about Keohane in particular, because he says he claims he's a liberal. One of the interesting differences between Keohane and sort of a lot of traditional liberals in international relations, he has a lot of similarities, but he has a difference, right? He's trying to some degree to incorporate realism. He's trying to bridge a gap between liberals and realists, right? And so he is giving way some ground to realism, and he's doing that on purpose, and he says he's doing that. He does it deliberately. So that's worth bearing in mind, that as we talk about liberal institutionalism, right, we might want to keep this as a special case of liberalism. Right? It's a case of liberalism that accepts some of the things from realism that other liberals might not accept. Right? So let's have a look at some of those things. One of them is, where does he say here? He says, I'm not a liberal because I am, I think it's towards the end of actually. Here we go. I am a liberal, not because I think people are good and easily ruled, but because I think that unchecked power is dangerous and that power holders therefore need to be held in check. Okay. So he's got and he talks about, I think, James Madison in here a couple of times. So he's got Madison on the, I think I mentioned this in my last video as well. I think, is it Federalist number 10 where they, he talks about the different factions and how we need to have a lot of factions, right, and so they can keep each other in check. So I think that's the sort of spirit that that Keohane is in, right? And he's asking us, look, the realists tell us that it's all about power, right? Interests defined as power. I think a couple of weeks ago we talked about the Malayan dialogue: the strong do as they will, and the weak suffer as they must. Keohane wants to stop that. Most realists will tell you we can't stop that. That's life, right? That's politics, right? That's political man. That's human nature. We can't stop that. Keohane says no, we can. We can have institutions. And these institutions, we can build them, and they will prevent us from just doing whatever we want. This is very, very, very close to either Hobbes, right, when he gets his Leviathan to stop the war of all against all. Let's talk a little bit more about Hobbes again. So you got Hobbes, his state of nature. Every individual in that state of nature has the right to everything, and everybody does whatever they want to do. And there's no law, there's no sovereign above them. There's no rules to stop them from doing whatever they want to do. And Hobbes says this is awful. I think we read also Kant, right? Kant is also similarly saying, you know, that sort of freedom, he's having a go at nation states that want the freedom to behave like that. And he says that's not real freedom, that's the freedom of the savage, right? That's not the freedom of civilized people. So obviously Keohane in the same vein as Kant and as Hobbes. Hobbes is certainly a liberal, although you can get into a debate about that, but we won't in this class. So Keohane is in that same vein. He sees what realists see. He sees the anarchy. He sees independent states. He sees the potential for conflict, and he says, "Look, it's not that I think that people are good and easily ruled. These states are not just going to be inherently good." He says, "Yep, I agree with E.H. Carr, the realist E.H. Carr. I agree with him that." People have divergent interests. We don't have a harmony of interests. States have divergent interests. And so what we need, which is what Hobbes says, which is what Locke says, who's much more uncontroversially a liberal, you know, what Kant says to some degree as well. Well, he does with the federation. Kant talks about the federation. He says, Keohane says the same. We have to have this, we have to have laws. We have to have laws. We have to enforce morals, bylaws. What he spends a lot of time doing in this piece is trying to argue against the realists who would tell him, like E.H. Carr, for example, also, who'll tell him, you know, these laws, these rules, these morality that you're trying to enforce, that's just the values of the winners. Right? So he's trying to argue against that. So it's a good way to read this article as an argument against that, and he tries to be a little bit balanced with it. He gives the two cheers for moralism. He says first, moralism provides an impetus to social movements that provide incentives for democratic politicians to promote liberal democratic values abroad. Liberals want to do that. They want to promote liberal democratic values abroad. Go back, think of President Bush, the war in Iraq. That's really sort of one that I'm familiar with, I suppose, living through the time, right, and seeing the events unfold and reading articles about what it meant and all of that sort of thing. But a big part of the argument was, you know, we're gonna bring liberty here, right? And certainly some scholars have written that this was like an experiment, right? One thing that we haven't really talked about it much, but it's definitely to do with liberalism. It's a liberal theory of the democratic peace theory. We have read about liberal pacifism and all that. Democratic peace theory, it's actually what Kant was getting at when he said, look, democracies won't go to war. But later, like more recent political science has sort of reformulated that to claim that democracies don't go to war with each other. So if we want peace in the Middle East, what we need to do, we imagine that Bush is thinking this following thing, that, okay, if we want a peaceful Middle East and a stable Middle East, what we need to do is go and create a democratic society in the heart of the Middle East. Other people around will see that democracy. and they will want democracy for themselves. Other states around them will want democracy for themselves, and this gets up to moralism provides an impetus to social movements that provide incentives for democratic politicians to promote liberal democratic values abroad. Iraq will be this democracy, this beacon of democracy, in the same way that the United States is a beacon of democracy for the world. Iraq will be a beacon of democracy for the Middle East. Social movements will form in Iran and in Saudi Arabia and in Syria and anywhere else, pushing for more and more democracy. And after seeing Iraq, and so we'll have a democratic, stable, liberal Middle East, which will be a friend to the United States, which will provide stability and of course, a flow of oil as well from there to the world, a stable world. So that's, so I've talked about that. I guess right now I'm talking about Keohane being a liberal and how he's a liberal, and maybe a little bit about liberal institutionalism and how liberal institutionalism tries to absorb some of realism, right? So we're not quite onto the second part of the question yet, right, which is going to talk about the checks and balances. It's a much harder part of the question, by the way. But to start with, let's agree. Let's go back to the beginning of the video and let's say yes. There is actually, through James Madison, there's quite a lot of similarity in the ideas, and in fact, liberals want to make the international system like the domestic system. Right? They want to have laws and rules because the way that Thomas Hobbes gets us out of a state of nature is through establishing a commonwealth with laws and rules and with a sovereign. Liberals in international relations, they want to do the same thing. They want to establish laws and norms on an international level that keeps nation states, turns nation states from sort of being at the very top of the system to being like citizens of a republic, of a commonwealth, right, who are abiding by laws, and because that's better. You go back to Kant, right? That's just better. It's a better sort of freedom. It's a much more productive, noble, civilized freedom than the freedom that we're enjoying now. If we can convince individuals of that, then why can't we convince nation states to do the same thing, right? To bind themselves to certain laws, to agreeing certain laws. So there is definitely, this is a great question because it gets at that. It gets at the desire of liberals to turn the international system, which is outside of nation states, right? It's what nation states swim in, but to turn that into a nation state. That's too much to say, turn it into a nation state. That's way too much. Liberals usually are not that bold, that they want to turn it into a nation state, but they want to move it in that direction, where there's a single set of universal laws that govern states and govern nations. And of course, we see that, right? We'll do later on in the semester, we'll do a module on international law, and we'll talk about international law. So it exists, and like how it exists and how effective it is, and all of those things we'll talk about later. But that's certainly legalism, the idea that laws will make the world better. Laws will enforce morals, and that will make the world better. That will make world leaders do the right thing. And he lists a few ways that legalism is working, right? So here I want you, as I read these out, I want you to think about the checks and balances in America's constitutional republic. So he lists the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That finished, I think, last year. But it was founded in May 1993. What were they doing? They were prosecuting. They were going after people that they suspected of war crimes, arresting them, taking them to The Hague, imprisoning them, and then putting them on trial. Right? And of course, Milosevic dies imprisoned there during the trial, his trial. And you can have a look online. You can find all the people that were convicted. You can watch the trial. The trial was televised. You can see that. So this is a court that's enforcing international law, particularly for those people who are suspected of perpetrating war crimes in Yugoslavia. The World Trade Organization has all sorts of rules and norms that govern the way that nation states trade with each other. The European Court of Human Rights was established on a permanent basis in 1998, right? So that's part of the European Council, no, the Council of Europe. Don't mix those two up, I just did it. The Council of Europe, that's the one where almost every nation in Europe is a member of it. I think pretty much everyone, Russia, for example, is a member of it. And they agree to these a body of human rights that there then is a court that's set up to adjudicate and to prosecute and to try cases where there might have been an infringement of these human rights. So that's set up in 1998. It's got jurisdiction over 800 million people. We're not talking about the EU court here, right? The European Court of Justice. We're talking about the European Court of Human Rights, which is separate. It's not related to the EU. It just has some of the same members, and then plus even more members. And then the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which comes into being in 2002. So right now he's listed, when he gives an example of these institutions, these checks and balances, he's given us four courts, right? Four courts, well, except for the World Trade Organization, that's not quite a court, although it does have a legal arbitration in it. So I suppose it is in some ways a court. It's just not called a court. So then, to answer your question, then we've got to start to think about, okay, how do these institutions operate, and are they different from the way that the United States institutions operate? In terms of checks and balances in the United States, what have we got? We've got the Senate. We talked about this a little bit last time. Right? We've got the Senate that was supposed to not be directly elected, but now is directly elected. But originally, it was elected by the legislatures of the states, of the individual states, right? So it was removed from the people, and the idea was, who was it? I'm not as sure about which American founding father said what, but this might be Benjamin Franklin, maybe, or it might have been Jefferson. I don't know which one it was, but with the T, where he says that the Senate is going to be the, you're going to pour the, I guess people. And I've seen older people in England do this, right? Drink tea with a cup and a saucer, and you pour the tea into the saucer, and that cools it down, right? So the idea is that you've got the hot liquid, the hot bubbling liquid, right? That's the people. That's the House of Representatives that represents the people, and we're fickle and we change our minds and we don't know what we want and we get agitated and we get passionate and we ask for things that are silly to get, right? And so this saucer is the Senate, right? So you sort of pour the tea down into the saucer, and that helps it to cool the hot head. So that's one check, right? It's a check and a balance to the hot-headedness of the people. You have these older, more respected by better people than us, right? Respected by our representatives in the state legislature. Great. So that's one check. Do we have that, right, on an international scale? And I think my immediate thoughts is that we don't really have anything that corresponds to that, because if that's to deal with public opinion, there isn't really an international public opinion, is there? Right? And that's probably quite a big question to investigate, right? Rather than me just saying no, we could probably do some research and try and say, I'm thinking like NGOs, they're supported by governments, but well, NGOs, they're not non-governmental organizations. They might receive some funding from some governments maybe, but they're receiving funding perhaps from individuals as well, right? From wealthy individuals perhaps. And so do they sort of represent some sort of a world sort of measure of public opinion? I don't think so, not quite, but it'd be worth looking into it more. The other thing that I wonder then is, well, let's take the UN. In the UN, you've got the General Assembly, which is every country gets a seat, right? But we could say that this is not quite a one-to-one comparison, but we could have a try, right? We could say, okay, the General Assembly, everybody gets a seat that contains all the world governments are represented there. And they're kind of hotheads, right? Whenever you see like some, really outlandish speech or passionate speech or over-the-top speech in the UN, it's very often on the floor of the General Assembly, right? And that everybody's there. And we know in the UN that that's not the, it's an advisory body, really. It's not a, its resolutions are not binding. Right. And then that could be the House, although obviously in the US, the House, this is as binding as the Senate is, right? But let's say that's the hot-headed House, right? And then the Security Council maybe is the, we obviously have the 5 permanent members who are the victors from World War II. And France, I should probably say. I don't know if you can count them as victors, but yeah, the victors from World War II. But the rest of the Security Council is made up by governments that have been voted in by everybody else, right? So that's, in some ways, there's some similarity there, right? In the sense that in the Senate was originally voted by representatives of people in states, the state representatives. Well, so similarly, in the Security Council, you have countries' representatives elected by representatives of countries, right? So you could maybe sort of compare those two things, but you would find a lot of differences that we're not going to go into, probably. So there's that. This is the UN, the Security Council, which is actually not one of the ones mentioned by Keohane when he's talking about legalism. But he does talk about it when he says, when he's talking about idealism and interests, the revival of moralism. He uses the UN as an example of where moralism has succeeded. So he says, the responsibility to protect doctrine agreed by the Millennium Summit of the United Nations in 2005, which calls on states to protect their population and provides for UN Security Council action to protect populations if the state with formal jurisdiction fails to do so. Right? R2P. Sorry. All right. So how are the checks and balances of liberal institutionalism different from the checks and balances provided in America's constitutional republic? Quick, short answer. I give you kind of a detailed answer first, but in summary, I would say, one, there's a lot of similarities because liberals are trying to make those things the same. Right? That's what ultimately their goal might be. And then we went over a few of the different institutions that exist that Keohane outlines. And tried some sort of a comparison, and whether you thought that was a convincing comparison or not, that's a good question. All right, next, Bobby Schmitu, who we've heard from before. Very good questions from Bobby. Says, I would love to hear more about what Keohane wrote at the bottom of page 73. Thank you for the reference. We'll go to it. Bottom page 73, that's the first page of Keohane. Let's see. He said, but when the people are not engaged or when they are misled by demagoguery, democracy may merely be, as Churchill has said to have commented, the worst form of government except for all the others. I like that quote. I remember learning about that quote in my A-level politics and economics class. Mr. Smedley, that was his name. He was my, we had 2 teachers for that because we had politics and we had economics. So we had a politics teacher and an economics teacher. He was the economics teacher, and I remember getting into it with him very often because I always thought that I knew better at that age. And we got into a big argument, and he ended the argument by saying, well, Churchill said the worst form of government except for all the others. And so that's the first time I'd heard of that. Anyway, Keohane's repeating it here. I'm sure he didn't get it from Mr. Smedley, but that's okay. When the people are not engaged or when they are misled. So why is he talking about that? They should rule, but they should rule through institutions. Yeah, okay. I think this is a very ancient argument that Keohane's making. He's attributing it to Madison, but of course Madison gets it from Aristotle. The idea that unchecked democracy is not good, right? Let's go back to Aristotle. He has 6 forms of government, and there's really only 3 forms, and each form has two versions of that form, right? So you've got the rule by one person, right? One man, probably for Aristotle. You've got the rule of a few, right? And you've got the rule of the many. So the few is like the rich. Aristotle usually says the few, but he means the wealthy few. And he calls it, in its good version, it's aristocracy. And the good version is that the rulers rule on behalf of the whole city. And the bad version is the rulers rule on behalf of themselves, just in their own interests, rather than the interests of the city. So the good ones are, if I remember it, monarchy is the good form of a single person rule. That's where a king is ruling in the interests of everybody, monarchy. Aristocracy is where the wealthy, the rich are ruling on behalf of everyone. And then politeia is where, and sometimes I think that's where we get our idea from. No, it's not. Hang on a second. Politeia is the good form of the many, where the many are ruling on behalf of the city. Democracy is the bad version of politeia, right? It's the bad version of where everybody's ruling, because it's the poor, it's the many, it's the poor ruling on their own behalf. And throughout history, the poor haven't got very much respect, right, from thinkers and intellectuals and academics, and Aristotle was no different. Doesn't have a lot of great things to say about the poor, and so he thinks that they're very easily misled. Right, they're given to demagoguery. What they want, because they're poor, what do they want? Money, and so they're going to run roughshod when they're governing in their own interests alone. They're going to run roughshod over the city. They're going to impoverish the city by taking all of the resources from the wealthy people, who are the best people to govern those resources, and they're going to waste it all and impoverish everybody. Right, and they're going to have flatterers are going to come along, demagogues are going to come along, flatter them. Promise them all sorts of good things, and because they're poor people, that they're going to go along with it, right? So that's democracy for Aristotle. It's democracy for Madison, and so this is what Keohane is sort of coming into this with, right? With Aristotle and with Madison, and he's saying, we can't let the people rule on their own. We have to make them do it through institutions, through checks and balances. We talked about the hot tea before. He would totally be on board with the hot tea, Keohane. We have to have these institutions, these checks and balances, make it so that it's harder for demagogues to rule. They can fool the people, but the institutions, the checks and balances, it's harder, right? It's harder to fool the senators, right, who might be actually, so the idea of republic, for those that hadn't heard this before, the idea of a republic is that it takes each of those forms that Aristotle talks about, the monarch, the aristocracy, and the democracy, and puts them all together and has them sort of challenging each other, right? Has them sort of fighting it out with each other, so that that way, it can't devolve into one of the bad versions, right? So if the Senate was all powerful, they might be tempted to become selfish and govern just in their own interest. Couldn't imagine that. Similarly with the president, who's sort of the monarch, right? The single individual. If he wasn't held to check by the aristocracy and the democracy, he might be given to just rule in his own interest. I don't know if we could imagine what that would look like, but that's what he's getting at. The people, they should rule through institutions. I'm starting to think now, like for the application of this to international politics, I don't see it immediately. All right, Keohane's definitely talking about it, and so it's definitely worth thinking about it. But we are talking here about a form of government. Right? Churchill thinks, I suppose, that democracy is the worst form except for all of the others. Monarchy, aristocracy. interestingly, Britain has a similar setup, right? We have a monarch, which is the monarch. We have an aristocracy, right? A House of Lords, which is an aristocracy, and then we have the democracy, which is the House of Commons. A lot of certainly countries that are influenced by Britain, like the United States and then Australia, New Zealand, Canada, have this form of government. The Americans or the United States is has the most separation between those powers, though, than certainly a lot more than Britain or the rest of the Commonwealth have. But yeah, I think I've sort of discussed that as much as I'd like to, really. It's a good question and it's insightful, and it gets into, because again, it allows us to think about what are liberals. All right, we'll do that again. Well, it's still recording. All right. I don't know. And